Hey everybody, it's Argent here, and I'm here with my friend Classical Theist. He's one of the best, I guess, would you call yourself an amateur theologian? Or,
Well, I'm very much into theology. I got into Christianity and Catholicism primarily through philosophy and metaphysics. I'm much more apt in that area as to how that relates to the rationality and coherence of theism and Christianity generally, I would say.
right, yeah, my interest is more natural theology and
Yeah, same here.
Neoplatonism myself.
Hmm.
It's kind of my main thing. But yeah, Classical Theist, I've known him for a while. He's excellent. I was just watching one of your videos. You have a very calming voice.
Thanks for the compliment there.
Oh, yeah, I was watching your introductory video. It was great. So yeah, so people, the links below. If you're interested in theology at all, please go and sub to his channel. He produces quality content. He certainly puts more effort into it than I do most of the time.
Oh, you
So
put a lot of effort into your videos. I've watched them. They're
yeah,
excellent.
okay. Oh, thank you. Um, People don't always notice it just because I don't really do any editing. But for a
Right.
lot of the stuff I do, it's based on like a full book I've read or something.
Hmm.
So you got into now. Were you born Catholic or were you a convert?
Well, I'm a revert. So I was
Revert.
raised in Catholicism, and at around the age of 14, I kind of get into the new atheist, four horsemen nonsense, and kind of bought into it hook, line, and sinker. Didn't really have any
Are you
reason
in
not
your
to.
mid 20s, if I can
I,
ask?
yeah, I'm early 20s, very
Early,
early
yeah,
20s.
because okay, so similar. Back that was back when like the Da Vinci Code and
Right.
Dawkins and
Yeah.
all that
Lots
kind
of
of.
YouTube atheism riding high.
Yeah, I think a lot of us got into that.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard
With
not to. I mean, it's very, it's we're I think naturally prone to rebellion, and uh, there weren't really any good solid alternatives to red pilled traditional Catholicism or any kind of theistic philosophical worldview because it takes a lot of patience and time and reading, whereas the new atheism it's very uh, vulgar and attractive and that kind of
well,
way and doesn't take much thought.
I don't know if it was the same for you, but I kind of saw Christianity as being like really lame evangelical stuff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well,
Like really anti-intellectual, really like
mhm.
praise Jesus, that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
Billy Bob's Bible Shack in Kansas. It's not very. It's actually quite sad, especially how and you would think as a Catholic I would have had more intellectual resources available, and to some
Mhm.
extent I did, but I was not presented with the full depth of it. Um, and for that reason, I and I got to be real. Living as a teenager, you have a lot of moral reasons not to go full board with Christianity. So that coupled with the fact that I wasn't really presented with a strong intellectual foundation for the Christian faith, I just pretty much bought the Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins line, hook, line, and sinker. And so a few years after that, I'd say around the time I'm 18, roughly, I stumbled upon this article titled "So You Think You Understand the Kalam no, not even the kilometers. So you think you understand the cosmological argument by Dr. Edward Fraser? Maybe some in your audience know who that is. Very uh, rising Catholic philosopher, and to some extent, he's an apologist. Very, very ingenious writer. And I thought to myself, well, of course I understand the cosmological argument. I've rebut it. I can rebut it in my sleep. I know it backwards and forwards. It's not a challenge. I read through the article and I come to find, what, I really don't understand the cosmological argument. I don't. I didn't. I fell for so many elementary fallacies, uh, and I didn't even realize it. And that kind of led me down the rabbit hole of discovering St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle and that kind of philosophical ancient and pre-modern tradition. And
Right.
that is what really led me to discover classical theism, particularly, and how that I think can lead to Christianity. And that's why I made my series to show that you can start with very rationally ascertainable philosophical premises, and take those, and that can be a bridge to very unique and essential foundations of Christianity in particular, and can make it coherent and rationally plausible from the ground up.
Right, because I know from my experience, I was only a hard atheist for like a month or so, a very brief period of time. And then I kind of went back to being a deist or something, or just kind of or I would have probably just defined myself as being like a Platonistic monotheist or something.
Right.
Because just to my mind, the cosmological argument was just airtight. Like I couldn't think of any real alternative to it.
When you really understand it, it is airtight. I mean, it's very easy to misconstrue and caricature it and whatnot. But when you really get at what the most prominent thinkers who put forward such arguments are, or what they actually meant, it's very basic and epistemologically speaking. You have to deny very basic concepts to. You basically have to be an eliminativist, like someone like Alex Rosenberg, who denies, that things have common natures, or he denies the principle of causality, denies the principle of sufficient reason. You have to deny so many obvious things that our common sense tells us is very intuitively obvious, and
I actually had a rare good philosophy professor who was a common sense realist, was kind of his philosophy. And it was really useful because he would say, because he believed that like your experience of the world was not fake. So he'd be like, obviously there's cause and effect because you experience
that's why
it.
Thomism is so attractive, I think, because what it does is it allows, it basically says, you know what, your common sense isn't an illusion. And that's a very big thing for philosophy. I mean, a lot of modern philosophy is basically built on epistemological skepticism. But Thomism says that you can take, you can rely on your sense experience, but we're also going to fully justify it philosophically and abstractly and metaphysically. And that's something that I think is very powerful, not only for an intellectual seeking the truth, but for having a consistent and reliable system of ethics that can still be grounded on that reason, and so many other things in life, politics even as well.
Because I remember he had a whole lecture on how bullshit the concept of socially constructing your own death was. Because he was talking about it, and he's like, so we're supposed to believe like you trip and fall off of like down the stairs, and you only die because you socially construct your own death by accident. and he's just like, obviously these things exist, and you're not stupid, you're not naive.
Yeah, it's basically we have to start with the fact that these things exist, and then figure out how they can be justified and grounded from the ground up, abstractly and metaphysically. You have to take them at their word, just to some extent.
Like people who deny consciousness in the mind, it's obviously different. I mean, it's you can try to justify it in a whole bunch of ways, but it's just life is obviously different from non-life. It's
right.
not. To me, it's just kind of self-evident.
Right.
I don't even think it's
there's
something.
an irreducible simplicity to qualia, right, and and the abstract, and that is qualitatively different than the complexity of our material brain states and the material makeup of our brain and neuronal relations, etc. It's qualitatively different, and that qualitative difference is not made up. It's intuited. It's picked up. And what good philosophy, I think, does is it takes that at its word, and then it abstracts how that can be derived from first principles.
Like another one, intentionality, obviously.
Right. Yeah.
Like people have intentionality, rocks don't. Like to me, that's just obvious. Even if it's like, to go back to Descartes, even if it's an illusion, that there's still a mind that's having that illusion.
Right. I mean, even if you go full Cartesian, you have to eventually bring everything back.
Mhm.
Because that's what people sometimes don't realize. Descartes, yes, he said that everything was subject to doubt, except for the fact that you doubt, which he actually got from Augustine, but we won't we won't necessarily go there. You can do that, but eventually, even using his method, you still can't deny your sense experience. It's still uh, salvageable.
My understanding was that was a thought experiment, and he didn't literally.
That's basically what it was. I mean, he saw the intellectual tradition as basically a hodgepodge, and he was very troubled by the fact that there was little to no consensus and certainty. So he basically tried to rebuild everything, reconstruct everything from absolute certainty. I don't really agree with his method necessarily as a Thomist, but he still
I think
he
it's
wasn't.
unfair when people
Yeah.
call him like a radical skeptic. I don't think he disbelieved in everything. I think it was just a
No, he
thought
didn't. He
experiment.
very clearly didn't. He believed in sense experience. He believed in God. He believed in the world in front of him. He just wanted to come up with an epistemic method that could be derived from rock hard certainty.
Just going back, sorry, just there's a point I wanted to make about the cosmological argument. I find 90% of the cases where people argue against it, it's using dishonesty. The biggest
Yeah.
one is changing the definition. I'm
Wait,
not
go
sure
ahead.
if you've come across this one.
Did you what? I kind of missed that.
Changing the definition of what nothing means.
Yeah, that is
I don't know if you've come across
that
that
is
at all.
yeah, that's Lawrence Krauss's stupid drivel. I mean, it's really, I think you're right. It is dishonest
It
because
is dishonest.
he's been told many times that uh, his idea of nothing is it's not just qualitatively different from non-being. It literally could not be more different than non-being.
He'll say
There's an
energy
yeah,
and dust and quantum foam and
right. That is without a doubt, whatever it is, it's obviously something that has being. It is some reality. It is an actuality, and that just justifies St. Thomas's idea that that which is reduced from potentiality to actuality is happens as a result of some actuality. That's just reiterating the same principle.
and I hear people say a lot, well, it just came from nothing. And I'm like, well, what does nothing mean? They're like, oh, it means energy. I'm like, well, then you can convert energy into matter. It goes back and forth. That doesn't prove
Really
anything.
does. It doesn't.
And it actually really bothers me. Like I said, just because I think it's intellectually dishonest. I think they're like, if they're dumb enough to believe that, I think they just are trying to hoodwink people.
Well, I mean, it's just Lawrence Krauss is a physicist. He's really smart, and science produces jet engines and iPhones. Metaphysics doesn't produce technology. It doesn't progress society, so it's useless. I'm gonna trust the smart guy. I think that's emotionally what it boils down to. I
Yeah,
don't
I
think I'm
agree.
caricaturing. I really don't think I'm caricaturing that much. It's on
No,
the
it
emotional
is
level of
true.
it. Yeah.
Well, it's like that way. It's like that Facebook page. I fucking love science. It's just, it's and it bothers me. The dishonesty. What's another one? Like a lot of, I find a lot of their arguments against theism is just adopting anti-realism.
It
In
is
an
adopted. Yeah, that's
anti-realism,
what it is. That is.
that's so absurd.
I mean,
It,
especially if you give them the classical arguments and their authenticity, they're forced to deny the most basic kinds of realism. I don't think they could even be uh, really. They have to be clear-cut nominalists. I think because if you, the cosmological arguments are set up to where basic things like the reality of change, the idea that things have essences or natures, or the idea of just simple efficient causality, the idea that things are
oh,
dependent
time
upon one
doesn't
another.
exist is one they'd like.
Yeah. What the cosmological arguments do is they take these very basic principles that we take for granted in our everyday experience, um, and abstract some. Uh, they discover something about these realities that don't account for them, the fact that they cannot account for themselves, and they abstract from that a necessity for some reality that is self existent, that whose essence and existence are ultimately the same thing, and but it's derived from these very basic realities that we just have to take that we just take for granted, and the atheist is forced to deny these or somehow deny the logic that they can't account for themselves, which is very difficult to do. So then instead they just resort to nihilism or some anti-realist position that I really don't think is
To
tenable
me, the
in
most
everyday
absurd,
experience.
the most absurd one, I think, is the multiverse.
Yeah, well,
Like
that just
God,
pushes the problem back. I mean,
no, but it's to me, it's way more absurd than God to
yeah,
say like, well, it doesn't solve the problem because the multiverse would still need a
it would
cause,
still be
but
contingent. It would still be
yeah,
changeable. It would still, and
but
it's
the fact that they're so desperate to argue that God doesn't exist, that they're
mhm.
coming up with this crazy, like I don't think it's falsified. I don't think it's provable. The
Mhm.
multiverse.
No, it's really it's not.
It's not provable, nor is it. And people say, "Well, God isn't provable." Well, but you could
And it
argue
doesn't
that
solve
God is
anything.
philosophically necessary. You can't argue the
Yeah,
multiverse is
the
philosophically
multiverse
necessary.
just makes it. It's the idea of if you're painting. This is an example that a lot of Thomists would use. If you're painting a fence with a brush, right? Um, it you can't explain how the fence is being painted by just saying that the brush is infinitely long, right? Because the brush of itself is incapable of painting at all without the hand. And so what these arguments are going to do is they're going to say, well, the reality of change, the idea that things are dependent on other things to exist, or the idea that what a thing is not the same that it exists, which is referred to as the distinction between essence and existence. These things will reveal to us that um, reality, material reality, um, and created reality uh, of itself lacks the ability to exist without some reality that exists by nature. And I haven't given an argument here because that would take us a long time, but that's what my channel is really dedicated to. It's really to lay out these arguments and lay out this philosophical system of thought, and ultimately to show how it leads to very key foundational principles of Christianity. And so that's why my channel exists.
Because I think classical theism is very important. I think a lot of what is like the most cringy thing, and I think you said this in your at one point that you like to try to explain these things without referring to scripture as much as possible,
Right.
which is also the perspective I take because it's cringy. People say, "Well, it's in the Bible," like, well, but
Hmm.
they don't. So it's a useless
Yeah.
argument.
But even when I go into Christianity, I think there are things that you can say about the foundations of Christianity in particular that you still don't have to appeal to Scripture. You don't even necessarily
No,
have to appeal to history, because you can
Christianity.
say that you could eventually come out with a philosophy of, first of all, establishing the existence of God, certain key attributes about God, um, the fact that He is, pure actuality, and these kinds of things, subsistent existence, and then also use philosophy to discern certain things about human nature, its ultimate purpose, given the features which make us distinctively man, our intellect and will, and to show how these relate to God as their last end. The intellect seeks what is true, and the will seeks what is good. And what the philosophical arguments do is they say, well, the true and the good ultimately find their referent in in God, who is being, and being is the grounding for what is for truth and goodness in itself. And that is something that I think can be approached by philosophy. And in approaching it from philosophy, you could then make further arguments about um, how this would relate to the the incarnation, and how that would fulfill a lot of these questions that would arise afterward. Um, and so that's kind of what I'm going to try to do with the channel. Another thing is that that I'll explore is that man um, has certain features about him that are uh, basically representative of the whole universe. So, like, Man is corporeal. He is also imbued with vegetative life. He also has sentient life, as common with like a dog or something, and he also has rational life, in one substance, and that's kind of a microcosm, if you were, of it, as it were, of the universe. That's something that a lot of Christian theologians have said throughout the centuries, and so one thing you can say is that if you can say that God has love, which is to say that He wills the good of all things, which find their perfection um, in being united to Him in some way, then it's very fitting for God to take all the hierarchical levels of created being that I just discussed and unite them absolutely to Himself. And I think that's fulfilled perfectly in the doctrine of the Incarnation, because Christ is man, that is to say, corporeity, vegetative life, sentient life, and rational life in one hypostasis, absolutely united to God. And the Christian story is basically us uniting Himself to that unification, to ultimately participate in absolute union with God, knowing Him and being united to Him with our will. And so I think you can approach these things from philosophy, and in approaching them from philosophy, you start to see a coherence and a rational plausibility that can serve as a good basis for the ascent of faith.
I agree. Yeah, it's like I said. I think it's an area that was lacking. I think, and I'm a big fan of William Lane Craig, and he
Yeah,
does a
he's
lot
okay.
of. Um, but he was talking about how there's kind of been a bit of a renaissance in classical theology
Hmm.
lately. I think it's broadly speaking, the Christian intellectual tradition is getting somewhat back on track.
Yeah, it's a bit of a shame though, because William Lane Craig, he's not exactly a classical theist. He's more of a someone who he doesn't even believe in divine simplicity. The idea that God is not composed of parts, and
Right.
that is very troublesome to me. Because I think if you say that God isn't composed of parts, I think, I hate to be polemical, but I think that's basically what I would say monopolytheism. Because I think if you say God is composed of parts, then He's ultimately dependent, and He's just one being among other beings. And He's not that, what Thomas would say, ipsum esse, subsistent being itself.
Hmm.
I think there's like almost like an infinite gap between those two positions. But I think you're right. I think Christianity, the at least on an intellectual level, is experiencing kind of a revival in certain levels of academia.
I wonder if part of that is just because liberal Christianity is dying out pretty fast.
Hmm.
And I wonder if as it dies out, kind of some of the more serious people are taking a larger role.
Right. I think that's possible.
Because isn't that gradually happening in the church, in the Catholic Church? Um, my understanding is the next generation of priests are more conservative.
I don't fully know the data on that. I think it's probably very likely. The fact of the matter is that the church is not attractive anymore in really any sense of the word. I mean, they have this idea that if you liberalize everything, you dumb things down, you appeal to emotions, that's suddenly gonna um, fill your pews, and really the opposite happens. The exact opposite happens, actually. Um,
Well, traditionalist parishes have lots of vocations, don't they?
they do have lots of they're flooding with uh, crying babies and uh, yeah, vocations as well. Whereas if you look at most Novus Ordo parishes, they're sad, they're pitiful. Really, they're not vibrant in any sense of the word.
Yeah, it's
That's
maybe
because you've
just
reduced God to an emotion, and that kind of feminizes God first of all, and that not and you can't sustain a religion um, or a theology on any kind of emotional sentiment, because that's a mix of categories that just does not go well together.
well, it's I forget who it was who's talking about the Jesus is my homeboy
Yeah, that's kind
t-shirts.
of
And it's like, I don't want a friend, I want a god.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that I can get a much better friend in that sense than Jesus. So why would I need that if all I wanted was friendship and fun and emotional good feelings? I wouldn't go to religion for that. I mean, I can get that like with friendship and community and that kind of thing. Actually, religion would be one of the last places I would go for that.
Because it's a bummer, man. It tells you you can't do stuff, and I just want to have fun.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. I think it has to be insisted that religion is not primarily ethics. It's primarily metaphysics. It's primarily truth claims about the nature of reality. And a lot of Christians like to shy away from that because they don't think that there's much of an intellectual foundation for it. But that's why kind of why my channel exists, is to show
Fideism
that no,
very
there is a
common,
foundation
isn't
for
it?
it.
Fideism.
Yeah. It's kind of a fideism, where they just they. I mean, for two reasons: A, they think it's maybe beneath the dignity of faith to rationalize it in any way, or
Mhm.
B, they just can't. They, perhaps like atheists, don't say the argument's convincing, but they just believe, and that's why fideism really gives comfort to atheism, because um, if all you have are fideists, how are you going to win a debate by saying, I believe in things without evidence, and I'm proud of it? Well, you've lost the debate, man. Go home.
Right, and I think something to keep in mind, a lot of people understand, is there's different types of evidence. Like there's
Yeah.
this idea that, okay, you can't put God in a test tube, so he doesn't exist. Um, that doesn't mean that. There's also like rational evidence. Like you can argue he's metaphysically necessary. The argument the example I always use is we have no idea how gravity exists, how gravity
Well,
works.
I mean, what even is a law of nature? How can you
Yeah,
explain what a law of nature is without recourse to metaphysics and philosophy? You can't do it.
no,
I
you
mean,
can't.
there's the idea that laws are just, regularities. Laws of nature are just regularities. But the problem with that is a lot of them are not actually observed. The idea of a frictionless surface, or idealized gas laws or whatever, that's not really observed, right? Uh, so the regularity theory doesn't work. And then there's the idea that um, that uh, they're just basically edicts of God. That was actually the original idea out of which laws of nature came from. Um, but once the theology of that was strapped, then they had to be reduced to well, they're just regularities, and we don't know really why they operate the way they do. But again, they're not really observed much in terms of what the actual laws are. So,
Well, we can tell by their effects. We can't
right, we can
really
tell by
tell
their
the
effects.
causes.
Um, but the nature of what laws of nature are has to be explored philosophically. It can't be explained purely scientifically.
Like,
Um,
why is there gravity? Why is it
right.
this
The best way
particular?
to do it,
Yeah.
I think, is basically what the Thomists would say, is that, well, to say a thing as a law of nature is basically to say that it's basically the quantitative description of how a thing will behave given its nature. But again, you need metaphysics and philosophy to make that conclusion. You can't just look at the data and say, that's all there is, because then you have no basis for laws of nature at all. You can't even speak of a law of nature. It's just absurd.
Hmm. Yeah. It's well, you have to accept the idea of a nature. I mean, it's the example I always like to use,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe this is slightly off topic, but the only I'm trying to think about it. The only real analogous thing to laws and to the way the universe works is systems that are built by people,
Hmm.
uh, if that makes sense, or that are built by intentional, rational minds. Because, like, humans can build synthetic minds in computers. So it would kind of make sense to me, at least, that another rational mind would be able to make us. And just people make systems that have rules and laws to them. I,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's a good way to picture it. Um, mhm.
But yeah, it's something that I think is kind of making a comeback. The problem is, and maybe I'll just finish off just because people will probably just talk a bit about this. Sorry for bringing it up. Just the current kind of problems with the church, I think, is really what is because I've had some success getting people to convert to Catholicism or to go back
Right,
to
same.
their or to go back to their even if they're Protestant. I mean, that's much better than them being an atheist or become Orthodox or something.
Mhm.
But a big issue is the like Argent. I really like what you say about Catholicism, but it's kind of a dumpster fire at the moment.
Right, yeah,
Um,
yeah, that's true.
like we got a pope who has no idea what he's doing. We have
Uh-huh.
bishop
Mm.
conferences who are out of control. And like, what would you say to people who say, "Look, I can't get on board with Pope
Hmm.
Francis. I can't get on board with
Yeah. Well,
the
I think
bishops, that kind of
the
thing."
main thing you have to do is to you have to realize that the truth of perhaps Christianity generally, but if you do more work than Catholicism in particular, it it derives from the first principles that I was talking about, and those are you can take those wherever you are. You know, um, much of them, a great many of them, you could come to in theory at least by being uh, a standalone hermit on some desert island that no one's ever heard of because they're from reason. So if these first principles and these rational ideas lead to the notion that Christianity is true and that the revelation of Christianity in history is credible, then that has to come prior to anything that might seem to cast that into doubt, given the horrible situation of the church. I mean, but to make an emotional point, maybe I mean, a simple fact is that we shouldn't really be surprised. I mean, this kind of church and turmoil thing has been prophesied, so many times in church history. Many saints have said that the church will go through trials and tribulations that would seem to sink her. I mean, it's so take comfort in maybe the fact that this is not a surprise. This is never a surprise to the saints or the doctors or the theologians or whatever. It was
Right,
kind of
but like,
expected. Hello.
just from a bad standpoint, people are like, I can't get on board when Pope Francis is calling for the destruction of my civilization.
Right. I mean, well, that's something we have to recognize that what he's saying is not true. And that's fine to
No,
recognize
no, and I
independently.
agree, and you and I acknowledge that. But I'm
Hmm.
just saying, I'm very sympathetic to people who just have
It's
that issue.
it's very hard. It's very hard. I mean, I'm tempted sometimes. I think any reasonable Catholic, is to see what some of the Pope says. I mean, is this guy justifying liberation theology? Is he a Marxist? I mean, I don't really know. And that's really, really bad thing. It's unprecedented to not know what your Pope believes about these things.
I mean, I
So
think it's scary that a lot of us are hoping he's just really dumb.
I
Or
don't
like,
think that I've I'm very afraid that that's not the case. I don't think he's just dumb. I think I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. It's not something that we can really know with certainty. But
no,
there are
I know.
signs that it's he seems to know. I mean, because the problem is he carefully crafts things to get around um, certain phrases that he's forbidden from saying. But he carefully kind of dances around what's forbidden, and that's very dangerous
Mhm.
and worrisome.
Well,
But
it's yeah,
yeah, well, one last thing I say, if you wanted to like wrap it up, one last thing I'm going to
sure.
say about the series I'm doing is I think it not only seeks to provide kind of a rational foundation for the Christian faith, but I think it also has something to say about perhaps the direction that other facets of life should go towards, like politics, for example. I think if you can establish the beatific vision, knowing God's essence as the final purpose of humanity, then that first of all that dethrones equality and egalitarianism as, the summum bonum, the last end. That dethrones that, and it also moderates kind of the racial deification on the right, to where I think it gives a sense of directionality and purpose for political theory and political engagement, to where if you've dethroned equality, then and if you have the beatific vision as the last end, well, then that makes politics secondary and economics kind of tertiary. And so you don't need to deify economic egalitarianism, but at the same time, you don't need to deify certain racial identities as the last end. It's a very good, it's a great moderating and directive philosophy that I think can be very productive, and that kind of thing.
Well, you just like, because
that's something I'll explore more.
I think there's kind of a debate of some people in these spheres between people who are social liberals and social conservatives.
Yeah, well, and what this does as well is it gives a basis for essentialism and realism. And essentialism and realism, I think, are the only philosophical ways to say that a man is a man, a woman is a woman, or that marriage is a natural good, or that property rights are real. It gives a good ontological foundation, the philosophy that Christianity flourishes best in, and the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, etc. So I think that's important to keep in mind as well. That it not only has religious and philosophical significance, but also political and social and cultural significance.
Right, because I think a lot of people are like, I want my white ethno-state, and I do too, but it's, what is it going to be? I mean, that's not an,
I'm not really focused on, I think...
No, I just let me finish. But right. It's just, I'm like, well, they put it as their only thing, but what would you, once you have your nation, once you have your kind of homogeneity, what are you going to do with it? Or is it just going to be degeneracy with white people? Is it just going to be degeneracy with your own people? Or do you want to have a higher society? I guess is kind of like what do you want your purpose of society to be?
Yeah.
Because it's not really, and I think this is an error, and kind of my main objection to National Socialism is it places the race above everything else.
Exactly, and my thing is, what essentialism and realism and the idea, and the philosophical ideas that are gonna, that underpin kind of Christianity is that, again, as you say, we can recognize racial and cultural differences, right? This allows us to recognize racial and cultural differences, but we don't. But we have an end. We have a purpose that does transcend those. So there is a unity to humanity that we have to respect, and we have to realize that charity extends to all. But at the same time, we don't have to be absolute egalitarians. So it's good. It's a great moderating influence.
Well, like from my perspective, I do feel a sense of protectiveness towards Middle Eastern Christians, that I do want to, they're my co-religionists, I do want to help them. That doesn't necessarily mean I want everybody to immigrate here.
Right,
but like even to Christians in Africa who are like in Nigeria who are getting killed by Muslims, I do kind of want to help them out. That doesn't mean I want them here, but they are kind of co-religionists.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I think that covers most of what we wanted. Was there anything else you wanted to say?
No, I don't think so. I really appreciate you for having me on.
Oh, no, thanks for having me on. Great time. Lots of good discussion. So I have a link in the description. I'll just post this again. Please check out Classical Theist Channel. Subscribe and watch his new series. And have a good Sunday, everybody. I might be streaming Mass Effect Andromeda later if I can get it installed. And we'll have some fun with that. Talk to you guys later.